Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The anon who wrote the first Greentext, which was featured in the appeasement video, has returned to X to post more stories involving his grandmother. If you wish to skip it, then click the next story. I felt like it makes sense to include it in the beginning so you can understand what is going on.
I don't have many X stories saved onto my drive or in my memory, but I got a pretty long tale involving my grandma and a lot of weird shit in Kentucky. Most of it comes from when I was living with my grandma for a few years. Roughly from 2002 to 2004 if memory serves, and while there were gaps between the weird occurrences, it sure didn't feel like it. I should also mention I was living with my grandma at the time because of the death of my parents. I was 15 when I moved in with her in 2002, and I was, at least at the time, a deadbeat high school dropout. I figure I'll tell one of the shorter tales to see if anyone's interested, or if I should GTFO. My grandma was very, very Irish, and she was fiercely loyal to the folk traditions of the Emerald Isle. She had a very particular arrangement of decorations in every single room: a crucifix with Jesus upon the cross, 2 fairy wall ornaments, and either a teddy bear or some other stuffed animal. She would always tell me that it was to appease the fae of the land, while still showing reverence unto Jesus, but being an angsty teen I thought it was all bullshit. The first night I had slept in my bedroom at the farmhouse, I tossed out a majority of the decorations with exception to the crucifix. When I woke up in the morning, everything I had in the room was misplaced, slightly. It was a weird feeling waking up in a room you had just gone to sleep in, and noticing that every single decoration and piece of furniture was moved ajar by just a few inches. Just enough to notice, but enough to make you double take if it was always like that. I tried to ignore it, but it kept bugging me all day, and in the evening I went back up to my room and rearranged everything just how I remembered it. Nothing would really happen until much later, when I was just about to go to bed. I heard a loud, sharp tapping coming from the window, and it immediately jolted me awake, but I found myself paralyzed. I guess it must have been sleep paralysis, but most accounts I hear about sleep paralysis describe it coming after someone wakes up, while this was just as I was about to fall asleep. I was stuck in my bed as I saw the window slide open, and some sort of silhouette entered. Lanky, but pot-bellied. I couldn't make out any of its features, as it stood at the very edge of the moonlight from the window. I felt this just distinct desire to vomit. I couldn't really sense anything else. I couldn't smell, taste, or even really hear. All I heard was that sound of the ocean you hear when you put your ear up to a seashell. Just as the figure was about to approach my bed, I heard someone rushing to the door of my room. The doorknob rattled, as I had locked it before I went to bed, and I heard my grandma shout something through the door. I think it was maybe something in native Irish, I'm not quite sure, but the creature hissed and slowly crawled out through the window once more, and the paralysis was broken. I immediately upchucked all over the bedsheets and scrambled to unlock the door for my grandma, who proceeded to give me a stern lecture about removing the decoration, and how this is what happens when you don't appease the fae. This story comes much later. It was mid-December and freezing outside. We decided to have a little snow day, lighting up a raging fire and relaxing with some Christmas classics. Grandma ended up going to bed early, probably around 6 p.m. It gets really dark around here really early, and I was staying up late watching some movies while Grandma was asleep. I had the TV on low volume, and the lights dimmed. It was during a scene I can't quite remember in the middle of Nightmare on Elm Street that I heard something quite loud from outside the window to the porch. There was a bench on the porch that was strung up on these metal chains, and I heard very clearly the chains just snapping in two and the bench falling to the ground. I jumped out of my skin at first, but turned on a lamp by the door to peer through the window and get a good look. The swing was broken, of course, but staring through the partially frosted window, I felt this intense dread wash over me. I sucked in air through my teeth and went to close the blinds, trying to tell myself that maybe watching horror movies was just making me jumpy. And then I realized what was filling me with this dread. Something was sitting at the very edge of the light coming from the house. I could only make out a vague silhouette, but it was the same lanky, pot-bellied figure I had seen during my spell of sleep paralysis. I felt my heart jump into my throat as I slammed the blinds shut as fast as I could, turning off the lamp and sitting down on the couch, trying to tell myself that I, again, was just imagining things. This didn't quite work. Especially not when I heard something press up against the door. Not collide with it, mind you, it just sounded like something, or someone, was leaning against it. I got a distinct sense that, under no circumstance, should I look at whatever was pressing itself against the door. I should note that the front door had a pretty large peephole at about eye level. I tried to carefully get up off the couch, keeping my eyes pointed towards the floor to keep from seeing whatever was there. I heard this distinct, soft coo from the door. Like how a mom coos to her baby, and I felt myself wanting to cry. Maybe it was memories of my mom before her death, or something else, but I was torn in two mentally between wanting to turn and embrace whatever was at the door, and getting away as fast as I could. I tried to get my bearings, thinking for a moment and doing my best to swallow the fear in my throat, and I got a bright idea. I grabbed the crucifix from the wall in the room, closed my eyes, and pointed it towards the door. No matter how hard I shut my eyes, however, I saw it, and I saw it writhe in agony and scramble back from the sight of Jesus on the cross. It looked so just evil, just from a glance. Twisted, with gnarled spikes protruding from its flesh, and I realized what I once thought was a potbelly was in fact its grinning face. What sat upon its shoulders was some amorphous lump of flesh that driveled pus and phlegm. I burst into tears at the sight, and before long my grandma was rushing down the stairs, finding me curled up in a ball in the corner of the living room clutching the cross, the TV blasting static and drowning out my muffled sobbing. Adopting a trip to occasionally share some of my stories here. I was typing this one out, but my PC blue screened for some reason mid-typing. This is a small one, but I figured I should share it. My grandma used to own a few chickens when I was staying with her. They lived behind her house and would lay 4 to 6 eggs almost daily. I'm not a master of biology, but even at the time that seemed very off to me. I tried not to pay much mind to it. I found that after a while living at her house, questioning the supernatural just leads to things like the sleep paralysis story. My grandma never let me feed them up until I had gotten used to the supernatural happenings at the house, and I stopped asking questions. It was on an early morning sometime around Easter that she had sent me to go feed the chickens, as well as collect the eggs from their coop. Something, however, caught my eye while I was collecting them and dropping seeds on the ground for them to eat. Of all things, there was this small burrow behind the coop, about the size of a large cat. It wouldn't be until later that night that curiosity got the better of me. I slipped out back with a flashlight and a glow stick just in case. I shined the light into the burrow and realized that it was far deeper than I thought, the flashlight not reaching the bottom at all. I cracked the glow stick and tossed it in, and immediately I started hearing rustling from the hole after the glow stick landed at the bottom. A small, dirty hand shot out from where the burrow seemed to curve and grabbed the glow stick, snatching it. There was more rustling for 2 or 3 seconds before a hissing sound and the glow stick erupting back out from the hole, almost hitting me in the face. The next day, perhaps coincidentally, my wallet was missing and I only found it later by the burrow when feeding the chickens. All my coins were taken, and all that was left was a few dollars and my driver's license. Back with some more stories. I feel like I should get around to telling a pretty long one. My grandma, being as religious as she was, would regularly force me to go to church. She wasn't Catholic like a lot of Irish people, she was Pentecostal. Every Sunday she'd drag me off to the local Pentecostal church for a sermon. Again, I was a pretty edgy shithead teen for a time, so I wasn't buying a lot of it, practically dozing off in the sermons, until one particular day in I think July, just a few days before my birthday, the pastor brought out this massive, dark gray snake. Pretty sure it was a black mamba, although I could be wrong. My attention was immediately grabbed, and even more so when he called my name out. I never handled this snake before, and I thought it wasn't venomous. I love snakes as animals, I find them quite fascinating, and I jumped at the chance to actually handle one. I was a bit apprehensive as anyone would be when holding a massive snake, but the pastor reassured me things would be fine, and that the Lord would protect me. I carefully pet the snake, and it scurried back a bit, opening its jaw and showing off its fangs, and the pastor handed me a dead rat by the tail to feed it. I held it over the small cage the snake was coiled up in, and it leaped, but not for the rat. Its fangs sunk into my wrist and I screamed in pain, flailing my wrist on instinct to get it to let go. The pastor began a sermon as I was having a panic attack and trying to get the snake's fangs out from my wrist, and everything started to blur from the adrenaline. Eventually the snake let go, and I stumbled for my grandma, begging her to take me to the hospital, but she brushed it off and told me I was fine. I was forced to sit in that sweltering hot church as it felt like my veins were bubbling from the bite. The snake seemed to stare me down as I was sprawled in the church pew. By the time we got home I could barely walk, having to almost crawl up the stairs to get to my bedroom, and I collapsed on the edge of the bed, barely able to crawl into it. I should mention something for this part of the story. No one really lived near my grandma. She lived in this little corner of Appalachian wilderness with a wide plain behind it. The one person who would regularly visit, however, was my grandma's second son and my maternal uncle. I'll just call him Uncle for now. I was bedridden for the next few days after my encounter with the snake. It felt like a migraine throughout my entire body, and any slight movement made me shiver and want to vomit. I felt like I was dying, and I was desperate to go to a hospital, but Granny refused to take me. All I could eat during this period was soup. I don't know what was in it, but I remember it tasting both bitter and acrid, yet savory at the same time. When my birthday came, I woke in the early hours of the morning. Either 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., I'm not quite sure, but I was awoken by someone, or something, screaming bloody murder. After so many days of rest, I had at least the strength to sit up and peer out the window in my bedroom. Out in the plains, on this large rock, I saw what looked like a glowing woman just sitting there, crying and screaming. Again, I had learned not to question the supernatural shit that went down at Grandma's house, and I tried to force myself to rationalize it as just a hallucination from the venom, but I know what I saw. A banshee. I laid back in bed, already exerted from such minimal movement, and I quickly found myself passing out once more. When I awoke at around 12 p.m., a gift box sat on my bed, and I felt in every way better. Unnaturally so, I hadn't taken a single drop of medicine yet. I felt just fine. The box was a gift from my uncle. It was a dusty PS2 and a few old discs for various games. I got up out of bed to go tell my grandma I was feeling better. Downstairs I found a party set up for me, or most of it. There wasn't a cake, but there were birthday streamers and the like. It's something I want to feel nostalgic for, but it's hard to with what came after. I was heading for the kitchen, where my grandma usually sat, when I noticed immediately through the window that she was in the area with the chickens sobbing over something. I opened the back door to get a better look, and well, my uncle lay dead, having fallen from the roof and cracked his skull open on a small but sharp rock. My grandma had already called 911, and it took ages for the ambulance to get out here. It still lingers with me watching my uncle get rolled out on a stretcher through a living room filled with birthday decorations meant for me. It messed me up emotionally for a long while, and I think it did my grandma too. She grew ever more distant after his death. I feel as if some cosmic force beyond me traded his soul for mine and claimed his life, when by all means I was the one meant to die that day. This isn't exactly the end of the story, however, when it comes to my grandma's house and death, or the banshee woman I saw that night. My grandma got herself an old mutt of a dog not too long after my uncle died, probably as an emotional support, and it seemed to work. She named him Otis, and she was always much happier with him around. This time, the story comes from my grandma. I was actually visiting a friend that lived in town when this all occurred. She woke up one night to hear Otis whimpering at the foot of her bed, and she thought that maybe he just needed to go outside to pee. She brought him downstairs and opened the front door, sitting on the porch while waiting for him to do his business. Immediately she noticed while he was out there the faint sound of a woman sobbing, off in the distance, coming from the woods in front of her property. Grandma wasn't one to take shit from spirits, so she immediately grabbed Otis by his collar and dragged him through the door, bolting the lock and bringing him up to her room. How Otis died, though, is much more alarming. My grandma woke that morning and went to step into her slippers before getting out of bed, and immediately felt a wet squish under her feet. Otis' mutilated corpse was left by her bedside. She was a wreck when I returned a few days after this, bringing out a bottle of strong Jack that she kept at the back of the fridge, having already drank it down to a sliver by the time I found her. I have to go for a bit again, my fellow X-Files, but I hope these tales keep you all sated.
I actually could write a ton about Selkies. There's a couple of family legends and weird bits in my family. We're an old Irish family line, and all the parents tell their children about how they have Selkie blood. I've pretty much been raised on tales of babies found in the surf wrapped in fur a few hundred years back, or every few generations a woman from our family returning to the sea. Stories about how the men would go fishing and hide their clothes, then dive in and catch the fish by hand or mouth. For those of you who don't know, Selkies are seals with the ability to shed their skin and turn into humans, or humans that can turn into seals. Whichever floats your boat. Most Selkies that get stuck in human form have their seal skins tricked away from them or stolen, but some fall in love with humans and burn their own skins to bind themselves to the land. However, they still have the ability to have Selkie children. I'm studying marine biology and moved away from my home to be by the sea, which I've always felt some kind of connection with. I'm out swimming in it pretty much every week, snorkeling round the islands. I think the real blood probably skipped me, but I think I still inherited that natural love of water. I was always told that my grandma was a Selkie. My mother used to tell us that her husband was a drinker, so she kept her seal fur in a trunk in the attic so she could go back if she ever changed her mind. My grandparents also tell me stories about my sister being a Selkie. She's terrified of the water, but she's the only child out of the 5 of us with black hair and blue eyes, and my grandparents are always inviting her to stay with them in their cottage by the sea. Like I said, I think it skipped me, but I don't mind. It's not something I'm cut up about. It's just nice that old stories and whispered secrets like that feel like they bind a family closer together.
Whenever a woman on my mom's side of the family dies, one of the daughters of that woman will receive a vision from the mother at the time of death, or moments after. And they always say and do the same thing. The first time I heard about it was from my great-grandma. She told me that she was the first to know that her mother was dead because the morning her mother was found, she had a seizure in bed. We all have epilepsy or vasovagal syncope responses in my family, so having a seizure isn't abnormal for us. What is abnormal was that while she was seizing, she felt completely lucid. My great-grandma saw her mother appear in the room. She was doing an Irish jig and she told my great-grandma,
"Don't worry. It's okay. I can finally dance again. Tell them I can finally dance again."
My great-grandmother told me how her grandmother told her the same story when she was a kid, and that it's always going to be okay because we will all dance in the end. I always took it as an old story she told about dealing with the death of a loved one, and my mom took it that way as well. Fast forward 10 years and my great-grandma is in the hospital with a broken hip. Her daughter, my grandma, sat at breakfast one morning and told us about a weird dream she had. She told us that she had a dream that felt real where she saw my great-grandma in her bedroom doing an Irish jig. She told us that my great-grandmother said to her,
"I can dance again. I can finally dance okay. Tell everyone it's going to be okay."
Hours later, we got a phone call from my great-grandfather telling us she had just died from pneumonia. 10 more years later now, my grandma had a severe hip injury that got infected. While she was in the hospital, my mom, who doesn't believe any of this, calls me crying because she just had the dream. The dream was that her mother was in her room doing an Irish jig. She told my mom,
"I can dance here. It's nice here and I can dance. But I must come back. I don't want to, but it will be okay."
The next day we find out she had died for a brief moment and was brought back. She eventually healed and is currently recovering from the infection and injury. If anyone knows a possible reason why this happens, let me know.
Anniversary of Grandma's death. She died just before my mom got married, 20 or so years ago at this point, so I never met her. Mom loses an old music box of an Irish cottage that played Danny Boy years ago while moving. Playing the piano when I hear soft chimes coming from an old cabinet. As I pull the jukebox out of the cabinet, the song begins to stop, just hitting the final note as I remove it from the cabinet. Deafening silence. Wave. The sound of the cadence in the room when it stopped playing was one of the most horrifying and beautiful moments of my life. I wish I got to meet you, Grandma. Mom misses you.
This story is from my grandmother. My grandmother was, for the most part, an average Irish Australian besides when it came to religion and the paranormal and religion. A good example would be her personal synchronized version of Catholicism and Celtic paganism, but I can get into that later. These stories are from when she was a young mother working in the mills, and they all take place shortly after World War II. He grandma, around 20, recently married. Father forced it after getting pregnant. Walking home from the mills late at night with husband. Come across the local park near the cemetery where Paley would appear some decades later. The park is pitch black, but something demands attention. Something is in the park, moving fast and erratically. Husband notices too, doesn't know what it is. Pay more attention. It looks like a dog with a sheet thrown over its head, running around wildly to get free. Thing is almost blindingly white and quite fast. Husband urges to leave. The more grandma pays attention, the less it looks like a dog in a sheet. It looks like a person, albino tear white, running on all fours around the park. That would be terrifying in of itself, except there is one detail that makes this worse. It isn't running. In fact, this thing has no visible legs, hands at all. It appears to be floating or gliding across the ground. WTF.png. At this point, grandma agrees with husband to get out and they speed walk home, all the time watching this thing in the park. It never stops or even acknowledges their presence. Next story, this time from my great uncle. He didn't know about the park story and never told ghost stories, but told this story in confidence to grandma. The uncle, taking a stroll at night. Walking is his favorite pastime. Walks past the park, nothing happening, just dark. There is a school opposite of the park. Uncle glances into the school and catches sight of something. Something resembling a huge, albino man was standing on the benches. For reference, schools here have benches where kids will sit outside to eat lunch before playing. Abnormal, but maybe it's just a drunk local. Pub culture is at its peak. Look a little closer, this thing appears to be wearing nothing but no details can be made out. This thing doesn't move. It looks like it is facing away from Uncle. Uncle tries to study it but only finds it more confusing the more he looks. He notices something. This thing has no feet. Here we go again. Uncle decides to cross the street and watch it as he walks out of sight. He comes to Grandma, tells the story, hand to heart that he would never make something up. Grandma of course thinks of her own and starts thinking something is happening. Grandma's story again. This is her final encounter with whatever was happening in that area. The grandma. Husband left. Got 2 boys to raise. Gotta work hard at the mills to make sure no one goes hungry. Work until late at night. Boys are at home being looked after by great-grandma and great-grandpa. Walk home late at night, not the usual route. Try to steer clear of the park as now it is possibly dangerous. Try to walk along the train tracks behind town to get home. Usually empty, especially at this time. Walking along, lost in thought. Come across a small hill. There is what appears to be a man facing away from her. Grandma always said she thought he was a drunk taking a piss in the bush. She called out asking if he is okay. Train tracks are dangerous when drunk, of course. The man doesn't move but twitches slightly. Grandma takes note of the whiteness of this guy's clothing, skin. Starts feeling a very strong sense of terror. Fight or flight kicks in. Grandma, being an almost 5 feet tall woman, of course chooses to flee. Sprint downhill. As soon she turns her back, the thing sprints after her. Oh shit. Run for what feels like hours. She can hear this thing's loud footsteps right behind her. For the entire ordeal it feels like this thing is 1 inch from grabbing her. Makes it downhill and ducks into the street. Keeps running until she hits home. Looks back and nothing is there. Thanks God that she is alive and prays for protection. Grandma moved to another place shortly after and never witnessed the albino demon again. But her son would see it and dub it Paley a few years after. Grandma suggested it might be all connected, but of course there is no way to prove it. Personally, my theory is that all the stories feature the same entity. What that entity is, I have no clue. Perhaps it was a ghost from the nearby graveyard, a demon, some form of skinwalker or whatever. I don't know, but whatever it was certainly had malicious intent. To add on to this, I should tell a story that a taxi driver told my grandma. He told my grandma to never walk at night in the park, cemetery. The taxi driver. Walk through the park at night. Hear big, heavy footsteps behind. Don't look back, just speed up a little. As he speeds up, so does whatever is behind him. He decides to bolt and this thing bolts after him. A breath away from being snatched by scuffed Bigfoot. This thing sounds huge. Never look back. Get out of the park safety and turn around. Nothing. He tried rationalizing it as maybe a kangaroo, but kangaroos in this area are shit scared of human, non-aggressive, and wouldn't be game enough to follow a full-grown man. I think he encountered the same thing as my family members did. At least it proves we just aren't all crazy. From the perspective of my uncle, and is about his encounter with what he calls Paley. This took place years after my grandmother's encounters in the same area. The uncle, early 20s in the 1960s. Live with grandparents near a cemetery and park. Work further in town. After work, hang out in local pub before stumbling home. Have to walk past the cemetery to go home. Walk home after a long day at work. Be walking across the road from the cemetery. Suddenly something catches his eye, movement in the cemetery. What appears to be a really tall man standing in the bushes. This man seems to be wearing really black clothes, dark enough to not be able to see if they are actually clothes. Aside from the black torso and lower body, this man's face and hands are super white. My uncle always describes it as fridge white, so bright he couldn't really make out facial features. Think, great, I'm gonna be killed by an albino demon, ice addict. Continue walking as calm as possible while shitting in pants, try not to aggravate it. Every step he takes this thing copies, everything is copied. If he runs, it runs, if he walks, it walks. Turn the corner and head home. Look back, it stopped at the corner and just watches him go into the house. This continues for months, the same thing every night. Uncle thinks it's fine, but as soon as it steps to cross the street he is going to either sprint and hope to outrun it or fight it and probably die. Have a cocky friend, brags at the pub that he could take anyone on, let's call him John. One night John and Uncle are walking home. John doesn't believe the story of Paley. Uncle turns to John and says don't look now, but there he is. John turns slowly and sees Paley staring into his soul. John squeals like a girl and bolts home. Kecks are had and the nightly ritual continues. Uncle gets a new job and house, so he is away for some time. A few years later, when he goes back to that area, Paley is gone. Never seen it again or heard anyone else speak of it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.